Okay, so welcome to MTSS MicroPD and open discussion for November 12th, 2020, 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Today's topic is middle school LGBTQ+ programs and supports, and we have a co-host here with us today, Shea, who is one of my colleagues up here at the Department of Education. And Bear, do you want to just take a second and introduce yourself and before we get started?
Sure. My name is Shea. I'm the mental health and school counseling specialist at the DOE, one of the new positions that started this time last year, really to bring a focus for that mental health, social emotional learning, that supportive equity piece. I'm also the coordinator for the Climate Culture and Resilience team, which is a pretty action-oriented team in the Office of School and Student Supports. It consists of McKinney-Vento and highly mobile youth, equity, family engagement, SEL, restorative practices, and then my own mental health. Well, my own mental health is its own thing, but me also representing mental health and school counseling, social work, and LGBTQ within that team. My background, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And before I was here at the DOE, I've been a school-based social worker. I've been a school-based clinician. I've been a clinical director for an alternative day treatment program. So, a lot of my focus and specialty has been working with children and youth with trauma and some of the more significant barriers and issues. And a lot of that, when we look at our MIAS data, has been working with LGBTQ youth who've really been struggling. So I'm hopeful to be here and be support and to be able to outline and help some of the specific individual needs. And then through the MTSS model that Andrea has all the way up through what systematic pieces we can involve. So, yeah.
All right, thanks, Bear. Welcome. Okay, so before we get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of an update for folks that last week's MTSS MicroPD has been recorded without an audience and will be released around the same time that this video will be released. I just need to finish putting the audio with the slides. Lisa Backman and I were co-hosting, or supposed to co-host last week, and we got together earlier this week so that you all could still get the professional development and the resources that come along with that. So that is coming forthwith. Okay, so back to our MicroPD framework. This should be pretty familiar for folks now, but our overall topic is going to be middle school LGBTQ+ programs and supports. And the challenge that was submitted for today is centered around addressing insult and microaggression toward LGBTQ+ students, and particularly in that middle school setting. But when I reached out to Bear to talk to him about what he thought he might be able to offer, one of the things that came up in our conversation was, if it's happening in middle school, it is potentially happening in other places as well. And so while this, the ask that came in was middle school specific, I think that we're going to be able to offer some more global approaches and ideas towards this topic as well. So hopefully there will be things here that will be, important, or not important, but like useful for you to use moving forward. As always, we'll start with our exploration phase. And what we're going to do is we're going to address the MTSS framework for the state of Maine and try to assess this challenge through looking at the different pieces of the framework. We will go through the assess the challenge / identifying potential barriers, because it's those barriers that you folks generate that are in this webinar that are going to help Bear to tailor and shape his part of the presentation towards what are some of the things that are known barriers, and then may also lead into some other barriers that maybe we don't list or that he can offer for us. Then we'll move into perspectives and resources, and of course that'll be Mr. Shea, and then we will go to the wrap up and action planning. And that's where we will look at what actions you might be willing or wanting to take as we move forward based on today's discussion. And then hopefully we'll actually have the 10 minutes of open discussion time for folks to ask questions and clarify thoughts and ideas that is presented today. And without further ado, we will go on to the next. So today's MicroPD covers the following MTSS components in a very kind of global way. When I was looking at the 5 components and I was really thinking about, where this discussion was going to fall, my answer was sort of, well, it can fall everywhere, but then also, I really wanted to kind of loosely base this on the 5 components for this week. So I picked out things like levels of support for all students, because that's definitely true. Team leadership plays a big role, I think, in some of the things that we'll talk about and hear today. And then also that school and community engagement piece and how we can, utilize the school environment and the community around to help us navigate this topic. So just to kind of look at the problem-solving model, and Lisa and I covered this in last week's PD that you haven't seen yet. But what you see in front of you is the pinwheel of problem-solving, basically, where the problem-solving model starts with defining the problem, analyzing the problem, plan an approach, implement the approach, and then evaluate the outcomes that are produced. Here at the, on the Thursday MTSS MicroPDs, we really operate in those first 2 bubbles of the problem-solving model, defining the problem and analyzing the problem. And then it really becomes up to you to decide whether you have a problem that you want to address, what your plan is going to be, and then the implementation and evaluation that will come later. So today we are going to focus on, looking at the problem that has been presented and then kind of analyzing the problem from the perspective of different barriers and how we might be able to tackle those barriers. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at the upper right corner, and it is a little grainy. I'm not sure why, but it is, and I apologize for that. But here is a graphic that you've seen sort of before. I think in week 2 MicroPD, we looked at a different version of this graphic. And then this is sort of the updated, made to look a little bit nicer graphic of our MTSS framework. And if you recall, it starts up here with the team leadership piece. And the team leadership piece kind of filters into 2 different areas: educator support systems and planning and prepping for integrated student supports. That educator support system also feeds into the integrated student support. So this is where your RTI, your PBIS, your SEL, your school social work, school mental health, school counseling, all of those things are going to live in here. And the idea here is that this left side of the framework feeds into the ultimate goal, which is inclusive instruction and community, really, for all students. We have on the right side of the graphic family and community partnerships, which definitely plays a role in this discussion as well. And then equitable policies and practices will also play a role. And this right side here also feed in, so that the ultimate goal is the inclusive instruction for all students. What I would like to do at this point is go ahead and open up the Assess the Challenge and fillable PDF. And then I'm hoping folks will be interested in unmuting themselves and willing to offer some thoughts and insights to addressing our challenge today. So as always, we're going to look at what is the overarching need, what are some potential barriers that stop us from getting to that need, and then maybe establishing a goal that we can look toward as we move forward in the professional development. So I would invite folks to unmute and just offer as they see fit. So Bear, I'm wondering if you might want to jump in here, and based on the conversation that we had previously when we were planning for the professional development, we talked about some of the things that that are a need in this area. Are there some things that maybe you could help us put into the overarching need category for what we might need to consider and think about as we work through this topic?
I think one of the difficult parts of trying to put this together is that it you know, really has all of these different entry points. There are all of these different barriers that arise. And I think, I mean, maybe it might be easy starting with what are some of the challenges that we think face students every day. You know, this question really came from a place of seeing students, you know, being harassed and you know, being made fun of. And microaggression has sort of its own specific take, you know, where maybe even some of that is built into the culture. But does anybody have any examples of some of the barriers that students actually face in sort of the day-to-day? And we can just sort of throw out a whole bunch of ideas. It doesn't have to be, each one doesn't have to be its own barrier, but what are some of the things that you see students that you know, identify with LGBTQ community struggle with?
Can I ask I guess it's sort of a clarifying question. This is Anna Matthew. I'm just thinking about the culture more as a whole in schools that we're looking at, where if it's not directly targeting an LGBTQ student, but it is letting things slide, I guess, that kids will say that are not appropriate and not calling them on it. But then going into a situation where they might be calling someone a name or doing something inappropriate where it directly affects someone. And then they'll be like, well, I said it to this person and it didn't matter. So I think that that's one of the big issues for me that I think that I'd like to see addressed.
Anna, I'm wondering if a good way to put that might be thinking about how to, I don't want to say enforce, but just like provide consistency across the community when and having sort of a protocol for how to address those things so that they don't slide by. Is that close to what you're thinking? Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's like the bigger issue of language that's appropriate. And you know, I've seen a resurgence of kids saying things like, "Oh, that's so gay," or something like that, and people letting that go and being like, understanding what they mean in a way that they shouldn't.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, I think there are two things that I would, and I'd love to hear some feedback on if you have found this true in your schools, but you know, if there's a culture where a student can be made fun of or words, you know, sort of are allowed in that passive way, because the representative student isn't there, and so we let it go. Odds are it's not just happening with LGBTQ students. Odds are it's happening to a lot of different minority students, and that culture usually isn't specifically just, you know, with one group. And so, you know, the odds are that that is a larger impact piece for probably a lot of vulnerable students, a lot of minority students, not just our LGBTQ students. So that's sort of that bigger overarching culture piece that's really important. And then when it comes to how our students feel in the space, safety is sort of the number one piece that comes up. And do students feel safe? And that's, you know, MTSS, that's tier one. How are our students feeling safe? And so how are we defining safe within our school culture, our larger culture? And that, you know, we think about physical safety a lot, and we think about bullying and emotional safety in that sort of realm. And yet, are we including some of these other words and some of these other, you know, phrases in a specific way to address them? Has anyone else run into other pieces either related to that or other barriers?
Hi, this is Mary McLennan. I just think, given the way that a lot of students are now remote, I think that's exacerbating like the haves and the have-nots. And, you know, I think it's calling attention to the kids that are somehow feel less than, you know, because they have to, in school, when they're on remote on classes, they have to have their cameras on, you know, so, you know, you've got all sorts of different backgrounds. Now, luckily, we have Google that can change the backgrounds. So we're hoping that helps, but I think that in the day of hybrid and remote, I think it's really brought to the forefront, you know, the kids that don't have internet access, that don't have, you know, laptops, that don't have whatever they need.
Has anyone's school specifically developed policies around remote learning, hybrid learning, and vulnerable populations that they could share? I'm just curious. It's kind of a crappy question because I know a lot of us haven't.
I don't know that we've developed policies. This is Anna again. I don't know that we've developed policies, but there is a lot of talk and communication about the questions that we're asking kids and the conversations that we're having around what their needs are on a more individual level, and talking to parents. We're using talking points, which I think is amazing to be able to communicate with families and kids because they don't have to have the same technology pieces. They don't have to have a lot of the things.
All right, so I've got remote on here. I've got safety, consistency on here. What are some other barriers that people are concerned about, or just things they're worried about either within their own schools or access systems? It's a good brainstorm so that I can sort of touch upon some of those points as well as some of the other ones that I've got. How are staff? How do staff feel about LGBTQ? What's staff culture around supporting students? Sorry, I'm in my basement. That's my furnace. It's not an airplane taking off. You know, how does staff culture, how does leadership view LGBTQ rights and sort of navigating some of the pitfalls that are there? What experiences have you all had with that?
This is Jen McVeigh, and our district recently did a professional development day where they brought in an LGBTQ experienced professor out of Minnesota who talked about statistics, the mental health, and how we can support those students at our high school.
Awesome. Was that Lisa Karnak? Just thinking.
This is Jen McVeigh.
No, I meant the person that you brought in. Do you remember their name by any chance?
Oh, yes, it was Todd Savage.
Oh, okay, awesome. All right.
So there, looking at the time, I'm wondering if, based on the discussion so far, is there a goal that we could set, like a small goal that we'd like to try to reach throughout the next 15 to 20 minutes of our discussion, based on some of the things that we've heard today? And anybody can jump in too, like, you know, looking at these pieces and you know, what kind of goal could we set for learning about these things and trying to attack these barriers?
Andrea, is there any way that you can make your screen bigger? I'm having a really hard time reading it.
I can certainly try. I'm very angry at my computer today. Oh, here we go.
Should also be able to slide there's like a little bar right next to our faces, like a little white up and down bar. And if you slide that all the way to the right, you'll make our faces smaller and the screen bigger.
Is that getting a little better?
Yep. Oh, Bear, that helped a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, there. Okay.
Andrea, can you repeat the question?
Sure. So I'm wondering, based on some of the conversation that we've had, so we've looked at the overarching need, you know, and looking at culture and climate that is safe for all students, particularly when, you know, groups are targeted with, you know, by behavior of others, language of others, not letting things slide. So kind of that umbrella. Some of the potential barriers that we've looked at, you know, so the remote setting, safety and consistency challenges, staff culture, leadership views. Based on this, is there a small goal that we could set that we would hope to achieve by the end of the discussion today? So is it, you know, it could be something like, you know, walk away with 2 strategies that I could use with my staff and teachers, or, you know, something to that effect. You know, what would you want to get from the discussion today, if you could get anything in the world?
I think that I want a better understanding of the barriers that we're facing. Like I like the brainstorming part of this, like trying to be able to figure out a lot that I'm not seeing, because I want to understand that. And so maybe if we're talking about strategies and stuff to look at, it starts with our understanding of our schools and the kids that we're serving. I don't know what strategies to ask for.
Oh, that's okay. I wouldn't expect you to. So what I have here is, so one goal that we might have for today is increasing our understanding of our schools and of the students that we are serving. Does that seem relatively relevant, Bear, to what we're going to address as we move on, creating understanding?
Yeah, I think it's a really good place to start. I think, you know, that's one of the big pieces of doing the PDs that I've been doing, is that really the base level understanding and the comfort and confidence in the material is really key before we even start thinking about, you know, actually changing things and putting things in place. So that's sort of where I was going to start anyway. So it's good to know that, you know, that's where we're at.
Great. Okay, well, why don't we go on to the next part then? I'm just gonna move that over there. Okay, great. Okay, Bear, during our conversation a few days ago, we had generated a couple of questions that we thought might help to shape this conversation. And then I knew that you wanted to look at some of the barriers that folks brought to the table, which we just did. And so I just posted these. You don't have to answer these, but this was just based on the conversation that we had. And I'm going to turn it over to you because you are the expert, not me.
So, you know, it doesn't surprise me. I think oftentimes we notice that, you know, minority students in general, sort of that something's going on, that they don't feel safe, that they don't feel secure, that there's all these different, like I said, sort of all these different areas that are barriers. And it's hard to feel like we have enough information, or, you know, if we're not part of that community, how do we advocate for it when we might not be doing, you know, the right piece? And so the first most important space is getting information. And I think talking about doing PDs with staff and why these are issues, I think, actually, I might just start here, because let's start with our own students. So here is these are our students. This is the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey. So these are our students who identify as LGBTQ students. And you can sort of just get, we're talking about like 1 in 7 students. That's a lot of students. you know, we're looking at gender identity becoming an increasingly larger portion of our student population. And really, this is why we're talking about this, because these numbers are staggering. They're in line with national numbers, but they're actually more. Our rates of students being bullied, of experiencing those comments that we're talking about. So this is compared to non-LGBT students. So these are, you know, these are other students that are being bullied, right? And here we are, we're seeing a much higher population with our LGBTQ students. The other thing is that—
I'm sorry, is this Maine's data or is this national data?
No, this is Maine's data. Okay. These are our students. This is 2019. So we have, so that data was from 2019, so it was reported this year. So this is the most recent.
Great. I missed the part about the Maine, so I wanted to just clarify.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are our kids. And yeah, one of the other big barriers in the LGBTQ community is the support at home. So not only might our students come from backgrounds where there isn't a lot of economic support or social support, but the fact that they are identifying as LGBTQ can actually make them targets. And so that they're more likely to be, if you look at the homelessness or the feeling of connected to the community, like we're talking much more significant rates of need for our LGBTQ students. There's a huge impact for our LGBTQ youth with sexual abuse, with physical abuse, with neglect. And we know that that then impacts all of these mental health outcomes. And unfortunately, the LGBTQ community for a long time was put into a mental health disorder. And what we know now, and we should have known it then, is that because of all of the negative factors and barriers in our LGBTQ community lives, that it leads to a higher rate of substance use, a higher rate of depression, anxiety. So all of those pieces become part and parcel because our culture is where it's at. So this is from our survey for our students. So I want to start with that because it really is significant and it's important. You know, out of all the sort of fact sheets that we do out, you know, we did vaping this year and we did LGBTQ because they've had such significant numbers for our state. So I thought I would share that. So talking about information, this is it's a topic I just presented to the CTE conference, the Technical Education Conference, and it's one that I almost have to preface and say this can be kind of uncomfortable. We you know, when we're talking about this, we're talking about sex, we're talking about gender, we're talking about penises and vaginas. Like, this is a topic that doesn't make people feel comfortable generally. And then we're adding on top of it something that has been taboo and that has a negative social stigma in our culture. And so how do you even broach that topic? And when we're talking about staff, I'm not even talking about it with students, but how are we doing PD for staff so that they're aware of this information from the study and that they know how to talk about it even just with each other? You know, and it's super complicated right now, right? It's more complicated than it's ever been. I don't know if any of you have seen this genderbread person before. It's a really great sort of thing. And I use it with adults. I used it with my 7-year-old daughter as well, because it's so accessible. And it really shows clearly the difference between how we identify, who we're attracted to, what our physical sex is, and then how we express those things. And that there is an expression, it's not masculine to feminine, right? It's not on a spectrum of like, am I more male or more female? It can be that I am not female to femaleness, right? That my gender expression might not be feminine at all. It might not be masculine at all, right? And so you start to get into all of these nuances, and particularly with the generations that we're seeing come in to school now, they are much more aware of this than any of us ever were or were allowed to be. And the information is out there for them to access. So oftentimes, You know, my LGBTQ students are significantly more up on things than I ever will be as a straight white cisgender man. And so it's really important for us to try to stay up on this as much as possible. This infographic has been changed 7 times, I think, in the past 3 years because it's constantly updating itself. So these you know, who we're attracted to romantically, who we're attracted to sexually, trying to separate those things out because it does make a difference. And that how we identify is not linked with how we should be showing it and how and what our gender should be and what our sexual orientation is. So this is a super complex topic that most people just try to avoid. And so talking about it with school leadership, where it can be very touchy and there's legal aspects of it involved, talking about it with staff who might just want to ignore it, and even talking about it with primary versus secondary education. You know, this is something that can be done throughout the whole lifespan. But how do you even open it up? And I think starting with the fact that this is a significant thing for our students. The other piece, just to make this even more complicated, we talk about LGBTQ, and one of the things we realize is that those are sort of all lumped together, right? So, you know, we've got lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and then Q could be queer, it can be questioning, and usually there's a plus involved, right? Which includes all of these other categories. It's also, some of that definition has changed where it can be, LGB and then CNO, which can be basically is not about being trans, but is being what is your gender identity? Like, how do you actually identify versus what your sexuality is, trying to separate those out. So each one of these terms, like we might have students that live in families who are gay, lesbian, or gay, but their student is identifying as a different gender, or are transitioning, and those gay parents might have serious problems with that. So even though they're sort of lumped together as one group, each one has its own individual barriers and stigmas, even within their own community. So this is all important to understand. Trans students are more likely to be bullied, harassed, homeless, made fun of, even than other LGBTQ students. And so that's a whole other level to understand and to share. And that the whole piece around trans and gender and language is its own thing. And actually, let me, I'll share with you all. I'll send it to Andrea so she can send it to you. Andrea, how am I doing on time?
You are doing good. You've got about 6 minutes.
Okay.
Before we
so I'll share this PowerPoint with you all. Let me unshare this. Here. Oops. And then share this presentation because I can use it to sort of zip through. But I'll share this presentation as well, just so that you know, you can use it for some of the resources that are in here. I'm going to skip all the biology and presentation and culture because those are some of the more complicated pieces. But one of the, so this is, heteronormativity is an important thing to understand. It's a lot like any of our other implicit biases. We just assume that the world is heterosexual, and all of our commercials, all of our, you know, all of our posters, our representations of families, our representations of relationships, they're in that sort of heteronormative way, where, you know, I don't know if any of you have noticed, but, you know, Cheerios had, you know, a gay couple and their children in the commercial. And I remember seeing it and being like, oh, whoa, like it stuck out to me because it was unusual. And that's that heteronormative bias that we have, where we just assume it's that way. Imagine if you are a straight person, imagine, you know, going to the movies and every single relationship that's represented is a gay relationship. Right? And you're walking down the street with your partner and you're a straight partner and you feel uncomfortable because all of the other people there are holding hands and kissing are gay. And so it's that heteronormative lens that we as straight people tend to see the world through, and it's what our culture sees, even if not. So it's something to think about, and it's not being sensitive to gay culture or aware. It's really, how are we making sure that it's equitable, that all of our students are feeling safe, that we're making sure that students are protected, and particularly when the lens is through that heteronormative view, that we're making sure that those students are safe. So I'll share some of these supporting pieces. The Maine Human Rights Act has done a great job. The Commission has done a great job of outlining really specific sort of bullet points for how students can be protected and kept safe. One of the pieces I really want to recommend is that one of the big pieces that schools run into a lot is if a student wants to change their gender or change their name to match their identified gender, that a school can absolutely do that. And while they can hold a record that has the birth name, that all of the other student records can be done in that student's name of choice, and that teachers and staff can use that student's name of choice even if the family member doesn't allow it, because it comes down to minor consent. So those are some of the pieces that schools often get tripped up on, but it's a really important thing to consider, because we know that supporting students in that change and transition, even if it's transition is a mess, it can be all over the place, it can go forward and back. Supporting that student reduces all of those risk factors. It reduces that student feeling isolated and alone. It reduces suicidal ideation, all of those pieces. So those are really important ways that we can support students. Another one is when we have LGBT students, Q students in our classrooms, when we go into remote and hybrid settings, making sure that we are putting policies in place so that we're not accidentally outing students, which means if a student has reported to us that they, that they are gay, or that they are trans and have changed their name and we're using that name in school, but they go home and now they're in a situation that isn't safe, that we are then using those terms or not. So just to add a whole other level of confidentiality, complexity, and safety around that. But just being aware that that's possible, that we're not outing students when they're at home. As well as making sure that students that aren't receiving services or that are struggling, particularly with homelessness and McKinney-Vento and our shelters, that they're really getting that representation, because shelters have specific legal pieces they need to follow. And it comes down to that responding to anti-LGBTQ behavior, language. Those are all pieces that we can be doing across the board. And it goes back to that consistency and safety, right? If someone is telling a racist joke, a black joke, and there aren't any black kids in the room, do we allow it? Because that way, a black kid isn't getting offended. We don't, right? We correct that behavior. And the same thing should be with any other negative behavior, and particularly anything that is around making fun of groups. And part of it is, developing that understanding for kids, why that might be the case, because it may be very confusing. But we do the same thing with, all of our other pieces. So having that policy, having those conversations about how we're doing it and keeping it consistent, that helps create safety. So those are some good ways. I literally could talk about this for hours, but I'll make sure to share this slideshow and then a bunch of the other pieces I have. I'll show you just really quickly, Andrea, and then we can jump into the next part. What was I going to say here? So this is the resource guide, and it's great. It outlines. Whoops. Zoom out these. No, I can't. Oh, there it goes. It really outlines specific state guidance, what the laws are, and then what the finding of court cases are. Because we're a local control state, some of the law is still pretty gray and open. And so schools are, I don't need to follow that because that's not in the law. However, schools have been sued, and the findings of those you know, those lawsuits have gone the way of the victims, not for the schools. And so letting our schools be aware of that they are engaging in activity that has been found to be unlawful in some of these suits is a great way for advocating and to have those. So, so yeah, I'll put a package together that has all of these pieces so that you can access them. And I'm always open for questions. Even if you're unsure of something, feel free to reach out to me about any LGBTQ issues, trainings. It's going to be something that's incorporated into all of our SEL, all of our trauma-informed practices, just like our other vulnerable populations. So I have to stop somewhere because I could just keep going.
All right, great. So I'm gonna go ahead and take the screen over again and take us back to, back to that slide. And then what I wanted to do is look back here and kind of put that image of the MTSS framework back up onto the screen before we think about how we're gonna work through our action plan. And then also, maybe also waiting and doing the action plan at the end. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But you hit on a bunch of things, Bear, that really stuck out to me. Because if I look at this framework, I see team leadership, educator support, integrated student supports, family and community partnerships, and policy and practice. And you hit on each one of those in a way that I really thought, wow, like that's so important. And it's like, it just sort of kind of opened my eyes in a way that really helped me to better understand this topic and MTSS framework as a whole, right? And so what I heard you say is that, you know, that tier 1 setting, you know, really starts at that leadership, educator support, and environment. Is that correct?
I mean, I think it's going to be easier to start there. All of us have been in situations where, you know, we don't have that movement. And so we're doing it in our own classrooms, or we're trying to do it on our own against, you know, a flow that we disagree with. But it's going to be at its best when it is a piece that's addressed across the board. So sure. Yeah.
And then I also, one other thing too, is in terms of thinking of tiers of support for students in terms of how we address you know, that overall universal environment, but then how we intervene and how we support when, you know, when situations do arise. We really didn't look too closely into like, you know, like a tier 2 or a tier 3 support or intervention for, you know, a particular student, but maybe you could take a minute and speak a little bit to some, you know, situations or strategies that you know of where perhaps, you know, a student that is the aggressor or the bully needed, you know, tier 2 and tier 3 supports to help improve their understanding and their behavior. But also what would be considered like a tier 2 or a tier 3 layer for the victim as well, in terms of, you know, giving them the support as they need them.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you look at the history of how we've handled bullying, we've used a pretty punitive approach and really tried to protect students while creating a system that punishes bullies. And what we found is that it hasn't been all that successful as far as a deterrent or even for behavior change. In fact, what we've found is that punitive systems can actually help perpetuate bullying behavior and negative behavior. So looking at restorative practices, looking at taking these as learning opportunities. You know, there's a big difference between a kid talking to another student being like, oh, that's so gay, and a student going after a student who is gay and actually harassing and bullying them. And so how are we using those learning opportunities and doing it in a public way? So it's not even just pulling that one kid out, but saying, oh, hey, this is the term you used. And just to let you know, we don't use that term because just like we would if a kid called another kid retarded, right? Or any other sort of any of those terms that have been normalized by our culture, we address those and giving staff language to be able to do that, so it's done consistently, not just hey, don't say that, right? That's still missing the learning opportunity. So building that in, and then taking those, so using that structure, and if it's something that's happening over and over again, looking at what are the other supports. So looking at some social emotional learning development in the classroom specifically for that student, looking at some counseling and extra support for that student, tier 2. And I think really for our students that are experiencing that bullying and not feeling safe, not feeling that the culture supports them, even if it's not directed specifically at them, how are we making sure that they have a place to talk about that they're getting extra supports, that they have an identified person. You know, we still know that the #1 part of resilience is having a stable, consistent, non-judgmental adult in a child's life. So how are we making sure that that child has as many of those as possible? Those are looking at our tier 2 and our tier 3, and that child has supports outside of the home as well. So,
yeah, that's an interesting point. I think you know, when you brought up the idea about punishment for the bully, right? You know, one of our tendencies is to use punishment as a way to deter the behavior, and that really comes between that partnership between, you know, team leadership, educator support system, and policy, right? And so if we can align those 3 pieces, it really takes, you know, a policy that is going to be inclusionary, but then also that the leadership and that the educator support system really is working together in that way.
I know I've thrown sort of a lot of information out there. Any questions, comments, concerns? I know our time is quickly going, but.
So I think that what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and do the open discussion piece, and then maybe in the last, you know, minute or 2, we may double back or circle back to the action planning part for folks that might think, oh, you know, this is the action that I'll take, or this is something that I want to pursue, because I don't necessarily think that has to be something that we all do together, but I think it's more of a internal reflection, unless folks do want to talk about, you know, a particular action step that they might think about taking based on something that they're seeing in their own environments. But for now, we'll go ahead and open up the open discussion and see what comes out of it.
I'm curious, how would people see some of these ideas going over at your schools? What's the sort of climate? What's the temperature taking for some of these ideas, some of these changes? I know right now we're very maxed out as educators. I'm just curious what the take would be.
This is Anna. I think that amongst our leadership that they're pretty good about responses and what their views are. So I don't think that it would be an issue amongst leadership. And I think it's part of our practice is to have these discussions and trying to support our students. And I think that Aisha's here too. She's our SEL coordinator. I think that this will be part of what we're doing.
Any other questions, comments?
This is Jen McVeigh again, and I think that, you know, you're correct. Leadership, I think, is definitely on board. And like I said, when we had the presenter before, a lot of what he talked about was also how primarily it's not often the kids that are the concern, it's the adults that are the concern. And, how do we incite that change at the staff and parent level for acceptance teaching, understanding, as well as we also, for us, I think that that's going to be a big one, especially here in Maine. I think also support of our GSA clubs and really getting staff involved in those and not just students would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think you're right there. Particularly with this generation of students, there's a very big drive to unite, motivate. I know a lot of students across the state who have started GSAs when there just never had one existed, and sometimes without staff support. So I definitely think, and also pushback from parents and the community against some of these pieces as well.
I'm wondering if you would expand GSA for folks that might not know what that acronym is.
GSA stands for Gay Straight Alliance, and it's a national movement to create a club within schools that supports LGBTQ youth, as well as is a place to not just for LGBTQ youth, but for anybody who is an ally. So it's can be pretty powerful. It gives a consolidated force as well as some national support. Hey, Isha, it's good to see you.
It'd be wonderful if we could do something at the parent level for that, sort of getting parents on board to be part of a GSA, but at the adult level, I'm not sure how that's possible or how you'd get people to participate, but I think anything community involvement is going to incite bigger change.
Absolutely. I'll include some of the Out Maine resources. They're a statewide organization. They have great trainings, really up-to-date resources. I'm going to be doing a number of trainings with them coming up, our trauma-informed workshop, as well as just some LGBTQ specific ones. I'm really working to get some of these LGBTQ pieces housed within the DOE instead of always referring out to other, kind of like passing the buck a little bit, that some of the guidance policies and recommendations are right through the DOE so that you can cite DOE rather than citing other places. So that's my hope.
So based on what Jennifer offered, if I had to take a look at, if I wanted to go back and take a look at, oh, where did it go? Where's my action plan? Huh, I guess I didn't load the action plan. Okay, so, but if I had to look at at the action plan document, and if I thought about, a goal and then some actions that could be taken to reach that goal. So perhaps, one goal is to, increase parent involvement in a GSA. And so what could be some of the action steps that you might be able to take for that? Or, is it to do a PSA or, some kind of like email campaign or some kind of, other way to bring that family and bring that community into that support system, right? And so, that might be something to think about, depending on what, your particular challenge or barrier is, and how you can create a goal and some actions to reach that based on your particular needs.
Aisha, did you want to share something?
I did. I was going to ask, because I came in a little bit late, what were some, because I don't believe our district is doing any sort of initiatives, and I would believe it would fall on me, the SEL and Equity Resource Coordinator, to do any sort of initiating. I've had a couple of kids even come out during some of my equity talks, and I'm not sure that they've been supported after that. And so my question would have been, what are some things that can be done at the district level to support some of our students that we aren't doing, and anything is good. So I'm writing down everything because I don't think we're doing anything right now district level for our district.
Well, we started talking about how just that understanding and awareness is really such a significant first step. And yeah, having a policy for what happens when a kid comes out to a teacher. You know, I think school counselors and social workers, that's in our training, but for the rest of us, not so much. And you know, what happens when a student says, I'm a girl, but I want to identify as a man, and this is my name now, and I'm telling that to a teacher, but oh, by the way, don't tell anybody, right? Like, these are some really nuanced things that we really could use some support and some global guidance on, because really it comes down to the high risk category of our LGBTQ students, particularly for suicide ideation, particularly for self-harm, and depression and anxiety correlate so high with this group because of that feeling of isolation and separate and not safe. And so all of this really comes down to a safety issue. And for those of you who have heard me talk before, I know I constantly go back to safety, but it's the base level for how we survive and how our brains work, is whether we feel safe enough. And that can be, you know, I see somebody else being targeted and making fun of, and even though that isn't me and I don't even identify that with that community, if nothing is being done, I don't feel safe, right? And so it sort of creates this pervasive, just sort of effect on our culture. You know, if anybody is not feeling safe, it spreads itself quite quickly. So it's an important place to start.
Bear, you remind me of when I did suicide protocol training at the middle school level, and how there was particular steps that you had to take if a student came to you with, you know, suicide ideation or any kind of suicide threat, or not necessarily threat, but like just saying, hey, I'm thinking about committing suicide. And so for us as the educators, we had a particular step-by-step flow chart, like first do this, then do this, then do this. And so we felt supported as a staff because there was no question about what to do next. You didn't have to look at it and worry that you were going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, because it was there for you. And then as hopefully you didn't need to use it. I think I had to use mine once, actually. But when you think about, you know, just how you can make not only supports available for those educators, but making them accessible in the moment as well.
So please feel free to reach out with any other questions. I'm hoping to develop more guidance specifically around this and develop on our website. It was just assigned LGBTQ. And I'm really happy to be able to take that on in a much more action-oriented way. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bear, for joining us today. I think that there's a lot of things here to think about and kind of ruminate on as folks move forward. As always, I will be putting together an email that will contain materials, links, and other things that were part of the discussion today, so that if you don't want to go through, you know, the slideshow again, then you have quick access to those links and resources through the email. I try to subject line them similarly, so that if you do a search for MTSS MicroPD or something like that, then they should come up pretty quickly. And I also want to say thank you to Suzanne Botanas for inspiring today's topic for discussion. I don't think she actually made it here today, so I'm sure she'll be watching the recording, but I appreciate her, you know, submitting a topic to for us to discuss. And thank you again, Bear, and thanks everyone for joining. And it is 3:30, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Hey.
Hey.
Went pretty well.
I couldn't see